Social media platforms have become an unavoidable part of modern investigations. Whether investigators are working in law enforcement, regulatory enforcement, corporate security, or intelligence analysis, platforms such as Instagram, X, Facebook, TikTok, and LinkedIn now contain vast amounts of information about people, relationships, movements, and behaviors. However, there's a critical distinction that students must understand early in their investigative training. Scrolling through social media is not the same as conducting an investigation. And finding information online does not automatically make it evidence. Today's class focuses on how investigators move from casual online browsing to structured, defensible evidence collection, and why this transition matters legally, ethically, and analytically. Most people interact with social media informally. They scroll, search names, view profiles, and make quick judgments based on posts or images. When students begin learning online investigative techniques, it's common for them to carry this informal mindset into professional contexts. This is a mistake. Browsing is unstructured, undocumented, and purpose-free, whereas investigating is intentional, documented, and defensible. The difference lies not in the platform being used, but in how and why the information is accessed. An investigator does not simply look around social media. Instead, an investigator begins with a defined objective, such as identifying a subject, confirming an association, establishing timelines, or corroborating an allegation. Every action taken online should be linked to that purpose. For example, consider a student investigator looking into a suspected fraud case. Casually scrolling through a suspect's Instagram profile out of curiosity is browsing. Systematically reviewing public posts to establish lifestyle indicators that contradict declared income, all the while documenting dates, sources, and relevance, is investigation. This distinction becomes critical when material must later be explained in a report, defended in court, or reviewed by supervisors. Social media content generally falls under the category of open source intelligence, often referred to as OSINT. OSINT includes information that is publicly available and lawfully accessible without special or judicial authorization. However, OSINT is not automatically evidence. When we think of evidence, evidence must meet legal and procedural standards. It must be relevant, reliable, authenticated, and collected in a way that respects legal and ethical boundaries. Social media content often begins as information, then intelligence. Information that guides investigative decisions, but only becomes evidence after additional steps are taken. For example, a publicly visible Facebook post showing a person at a specific location may suggest presence, but on its own may not prove presence beyond doubt. The post could be old, reposted, staged, or misattributed. Investigators must treat information as a lead, not a conclusion. Understanding this distinction helps one of the most common student errors: treating screenshots as proof without context or verification. Prior to accessing social media in an investigative capacity, investigators must define why they're doing so. This is called framing, and it's essential. Investigative use of social media should answer specific questions such as: who is the individual? What associations do they maintain? Where were they at a specific time? How do they represent themselves publicly? Are there any contradictions between their statements and their online behavior? Without a clear purpose, a social media review becomes unfocused and prone to bias. Investigators may notice information that supports their assumptions while ignoring contradictory information. For instance, if an investigator begins with the assumption that a suspect is involved in criminal activity, they may overinterpret aggressive language, symbols, or associations found online. Proper framing helps reduce this risk by anchoring the review to defined investigative needs rather than personal impressions. One of the most common legitimate uses of social media in investigations is identity verification. Imagine an investigation involving an online marketplace scam. The suspect uses a username rather than a real name. Investigators locate a social media profile with the same username, and at first glance this may appear to identify the subject. However, investigators must proceed carefully. A proper investigation would include checking whether the username appears consistently across other platforms, comparing profile photos with other publicly available images, reviewing language patterns, posting times, and stated locations, looking for links to other verified accounts. Each observation should be documented, noting what was observed, when it was observed, and why it is relevant. Importantly, investigators should assume that a single profile definitively identifies an individual without corroboration. This illustrates how social media supports investigative reasoning rather than replaces it. Documentation is the dividing line between informal browsing and professional investigation. When investigators review social media content, they must be able to answer basic questions about it. When was the content accessed? What exactly was observed? Where did it appear? When did it appear? Why was it relevant? Failing to document these details undermines credibility and reliability. Screenshots without context, timestamps, or URLs are weak and easily challenged. For example, if an investigator captures a screenshot of a post allegedly showing criminal intent, but cannot explain when the post was made, whether it was public at the time, or whether it was later edited or deleted, the value of that material is significantly reduced. Good practice involves recording things like platform name, account identifier, URL or unique post reference, the date and time accessed, description of content, investigative relevance. This process transforms online observation into something that can support analysis and potentially evidence. Even when information is publicly accessible, investigators are not free to act without constraints. Legal and ethical boundaries shape how social media may be used. Investigators must avoid things like misrepresenting their identity, accessing private accounts without lawful authority, encouraging subjects to post incriminating content, circumventing platform safeguards. For example, a common misunderstanding is believing that public means unrestricted. In reality, professional standards often impose strict limits than what is technically possible. For example, a private citizen might create a fake account to gain access to restricted content. An investigator doing so without authorization could jeopardize an entire case. Also, ethically, investigators must consider proportionality. Reviewing years of personal posts unrelated to an investigation raises concerns about privacy and overreach, even if technically lawful. Social media is also frequently used to establish timelines and corroborate location. Consider a case where a subject claims that they were not present in a city in a certain date and time. When investigators discover social media posts showing the subject at a recognizable location during that relevant time period. Proper analysis requires more than simply noting the image. Investigators must ask, when was this post uploaded? When was the image taken? Is the location identifiable and verifiable? Could the post have been delayed or reposted? A caption stating last night does not automatically prove timing. Metadata, geotags, contextual clues, and corroborating posts all play a role. Treating social media as definitive proof without examining these factors is analytically unsound. Social media content is highly curated. Users present idealized, exaggerated, or performative versions of themselves. Investigators must resist the temptation to interpret posts literally or emotionally. For example, aggressive language in music lyrics or captions does not necessarily indicate violent intent. Similarly, association with certain groups online does not automatically establish real-world involvement. Confirmation bias is especially dangerous in social media investigations. Once investigators form a hypothesis, they may unconsciously prioritize posts that support it, while ignoring contradictory information. Structured documentation, peer review, and clear investigative framing help mitigate these risks. Finally, investigators must remember that their actions online are subject to scrutiny. Notes, screenshots, and reports may be reviewed by supervisors, courts, defense counsel, or even oversight bodies. Casual language, assumptions, or undocumented conclusions weaken investigations and damage credibility. Professionalism requires discipline, restraint, and transparency in how social media is used. Finally, in conclusion, we can say that social media has transformed the investigative landscape. It offers us unprecedented access to information about people and behavior. Yet this access comes with responsibility. The difference between browsing and investigation lies in purpose, documentation, and accountability. Social media can be a powerful tool when used properly, but a liability when used carelessly. By framing investigations clearly, respecting legal and ethical boundaries, documenting observations rigorously, treating online content as intelligence rather than automatic evidence, investigators can use social media effectively and defensively. As analysts and investigators, we must learn not only how to find information online, but how to use it properly, in a way that withstands scrutiny and supports our investigations rather than undermines them.